Hello and welcome to Rage Quit. My name is Jay and today I'm going to be asking the question and hopefully answering the question whether or not Marvel Crisis Protocol has a scale problem. Now you might be wondering what the hell am I talking about. Obviously Marvel Crisis Protocol is a new game from Atomic Mass Games. It's a skirmish game based with Marvel characters, so it's quite hype. But during the Gen Con in-flight report, the developer said that the game was going to be 40 mil in terms of scale. And a lot of people have been confused, or not necessarily even confused, but they're concerned that that's a scale that we don't often get and it's unusual, and they might have difficulty making terrain for it and that kind of thing, which is fair enough, obviously. But I'm here to say why I think it's probably been blown out of proportion in terms of scale. Amusing. I'll move on with my life though before I lose my train of thought. Yeah, I think it's not as big of an issue as people think, and I'm going to be talking about that in a moment. Now, I will just a couple of housekeeping things. If at the end of this video you press like, and if you're not subscribed and you're interested in this, press subscribe. I have though covered in paint and stuff like that because I've been making my Marvel Crisis Protocol board in the other room, which is going to go on the terrain channel. So if you want to check the terrain channel, there'll be a link in the description below. But I do not have access to this game as of yet. I know some people are doing unboxings, etc. But we have got we've got a picture from Gen Con and we've got some extra information from Team Covenant. And really, to my knowledge, I think the scale issue is perhaps just one of confusion across the entire industry. So wargaming used to be 28 mil. You know, that was sort of like the standard thing. Like Warhammer Fantasy maybe 20 years ago might have been 28 mil. But ultimately, it was sort of like heroic 28, and then it became like 32, and then it's heroic 32, which is what 40k is. But I mean, it's basically just getting bigger and bigger. There is definitely a scale creep across the whole industry, and probably for good reasons, which we're not going to talk about here. And yeah, I just think this is a problem in terms of how people are identifying scale. So like 40k is seen as heroic 32, and the Night Models Batman game, I just burped, I do apologise, and the Night Models Batman game is like 40 mil, but really, the difference between those two miniatures is very slight, and I actually have some examples here that I'll show later. But yeah, let's look onto the figures from Team Covenant. So we don't have every miniature and the size of them and stuff like that, but it does talk about cars. So for 40 mil, people are like, well, how big are the cars going to be? What should we use for like terrain? And this measurement here, this 4 inches long, 1.5 inches wide, or you can look in millimeters if you want. I bought this car from Home Bargains in the UK for maybe like £1 or £2, and it literally almost exactly matches that scale there, and this is a scale 1/43 model. So that's what people are recommending online. That seems to be the case. That essentially coincides with all scale, or near enough all scale. So in terms of like terrain, if you look at all scale stuff for like trains and stuff like that, then you will be okay there. Just on a side note, I was thinking about The Walking Dead and what scale that was. Well, I actually have some of the Walking Dead cars that I bought literally just to do this comparison. It comes whole, which is quite cool. They are not identical. The Walking Dead one is actually possibly a little bit bigger. Oh, I'm not doing a very good job there. But really very similar in terms of size from the Walking Dead cars to that. So essentially 1/43 seems to be the scale in terms of terrain and cars and stuff like that. Now there is an issue with buildings, which we will talk about later at the end, but let's have a look at the size of the characters. Now it doesn't measure every single character, but we're going to ignore Hulk because he's a big boy, isn't he? So let's just flat out ignore him. But let's have a look at Black Widow here. So Black Widow is the shortest, but she's obviously just like a normal human. She's possibly a little bit shorter, maybe because she's a lady. I think might be they may actually be doing size differences like that, which would be quite cool, but not really relevant here. But it sort of gives us the indication that if she's the shortest at 35 mil, then I wouldn't be surprised to see the average human sort of range from 35 mil to 40 mil. And then when we compare this picture that came out at Gen Con, by the way, Captain Marvel here, I'm pretty sure is a similar size to Red Skull. It's just because she's floating on this rock. You'll see, well, you might be like, oh, well, we've no idea how big these are because we don't know how big the primary Space Marine is. Except, I literally already have this miniature. I've got one, just dropping stuff. I've got one that is essentially the exact same pose, though mine seems to be leaning forward, where I'm not sure the one is on there. And I've got one which is not leaning forward, they are essentially the exact same size. And you won't be able to see this, but if I put a ruler against this, to the head, I'd reckon that the primary Space Marine is approximately 40 mil tall, right? That's the primary Space Marine that seems to be on that picture, right? 40 mil tall, and I'm not including the base. The base can get lost. We're not interested in the base. Yeah, so we have a heroic 32 miniature that is essentially 40 mil tall. And if we're honest, Red Skull here appears to be very similar in size. Right, fine, fair enough. All very interesting. So it seems to me, essentially, it's sort of realistic 40k scale, if that makes sense. So instead of we all know Games Workshop's proportions are perhaps a little bit off, although the primary Space Marines are perhaps a little bit better, but the legs maybe are too short, the body's too long or whatever, whereas this is sort of more realistic. 40 mil seems to be the size of the miniature, which seems to be not dissimilar from 40k, and presumably games like Walking Dead, because even though I don't have any of the miniatures, I've got the vehicle, and the vehicle is the same as 1/43, which is what the Marvel Crisis Protocol is going to be. So everything sort of seems to be making sense. The only other comparison that I would sort of make, and I did this, I've been buying stuff just to compare scales, which makes me sad, but it is what I'm doing in my life. I bought a Batman miniature from the Batman miniatures game. Do apologise, the camera is sort of overexposing. And when I compare that to the primary Space Marine, they're essentially the same size, exactly the same size, which sort of implies that the Marvel game is going to be the same as the Night Models game in terms of scale and size. This looks to be the exact same size as Red Skull, this Batman guy. I don't know why I said Batman guy. It's Batman. It's man in the name. So it looks like 40 mil high is going to be the standard human-y kind of size. And that seems to be the same size of model as 40k. Now, what does that mean? Well, nothing really. I think ultimately it just means that all the terrain that already exists, people are scaling up 3D printed files by X amount to try and get it all in line. But the reality was that terrain already a little bit too small? I probably think it was. I don't really know too much. I've bought the TT Combat buildings, right? I've got some downstairs, but I've not built it yet because I'm trying to make my board first. But I'm presuming that considering that was designed with Batman game in mind, that the scale's going to match that game, which would therefore match Marvel. Am I going crazy? Maybe the buildings are too small. But either the scale is already fine, or the buildings were already a little bit too small than what they should have been. Either way, I don't really see it as a problem. Nobody was complaining during the Batman game that the TT Combat buildings were too small, were they? Maybe they were, but I never saw anything. Ultimately, what I'm trying to say is scale is a big issue. I keep using size puns, which is not intentional. Scale is an issue that I think people have got hung up on by the fact that they've said 40 mil, and really, apart from the Night Models Batman game, nothing else has really used that scale. But the reality is, say, the difference, I don't know what this end model is, but the difference between Red Skull and this dude who's already not stood up straight is sort of relatively minor. I'm reasonably tall in real life, but not massive. There are many people who are that size in comparison to me. It wouldn't be that weird to have them in the same game in my head, even though they're obviously a different miniatures game. But my point being, scale seems to be such a finicky thing, and that people have got hung up on this 40 mil thing, whereas the reality is it seems to be the same as the Batman miniatures game, and if anything, it seems to be very similar to 40k and probably fantasy, and your normal hills and stuff like that will be appropriate. The key question is buildings, really, and when we come to buildings, I don't know, I don't have enough information. That'll be something I'll probably touch after I've done my board. I'm going to look at 3D printing some, whether or not I'll 3D print them at the normal size versus the scaled up size, and I'll also get out my TT Combat buildings, and we'll just have a look at buildings and the scale in comparison there. Because right now I don't know what the most appropriate buildings are, but I'm less worried about scale because it seems to be the scale of a game that already exists. And as I said, 40k seems to be not too dissimilar, so my walkways and all that kind of stuff really would still work for this game. You're not going to put them on the table and think, oh, they're drastically out of scale. Yeah, it seems a bit bigger than normal in terms of maybe they're a little bit tiny bigger than Space Marine, but ultimately it's not I don't really see that being a massive problem. And it is a Primaris Space Marine, who are supposedly the biggest ones, but you get like a Primaris Space Marine against like an Eldar, and they're essentially the same bloody size, so it doesn't really make any difference. I just think it's an issue that people have been hung up on, and I don't really think it's a terribly important issue, because I think there's a lot of stuff out there that you can just get. If you've got a 3D printer, you're sorted anyway. You can just scale your models and fine. It's buying stuff from like all scale or 1/43 cars that really are the facts that people are going to want to know. So yeah, 1/43 seems to be the scale for cars. All scale seems to be the scale for like buildings, etc. If that's what you want. Other than that, I'm off. As I said, I'll probably be in Edinburgh by the time this goes live. I'm still very excited about this game. I hope people don't get hung up on it in terms of this one sentence that they said at their convention at Gen Con, that it seems to be putting some people. I've seen some people say, I'm unsure about the scale, it's going to be difficult to get terrain, which may or may not be the case, but I personally am thinking, is it like it seems to be already in existence, seems not to be a big problem? I wouldn't let that put anybody off. Now, there is possibly the question of how much modern day terrain exists. You know, the main games so far in the past have all been like fantasy or like sci-fi. Now we're saying, hey, what about a modern city game? Thankfully, people have already got stuff from maybe like Walking Dead. So there is stuff that's already out there, and I'm just hoping, we'll see. But we've not had time to see, like, the Legion had lots of, like, 3D printed files. We've not really had time for the Marvel game to get all of its 3D printed files. But my words, they will come. And they already exist. Like, I know Corvus do some, and they look pretty fine. And they're the ones I'm probably going to buy and print. So they already exist in some senses. And there's stuff on Thingiverse for, like, bins and trolleys and all pallets and all that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of stuff out there for 3D printers. It's for you non-3D printers that I think we probably want to look towards the Batman miniatures game for now, and then we'll compare and contrast later on. I'm off. Have a most beautiful day. Like and subscribe. I do apologize, this video's been a bit rambly. We are heading to Edinburgh literally after I've released this video. I'll put it online, so do forgive me for my rambliness. Have a most beautiful day. Goodbye.